This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Constitutional law expert Ian Millhiser takes the Supreme Court apart and, in light of the arguments on same-sex marriage, says no one wants a world where business can discriminate because you're gay. With the latest numbers showing the economy flattening out, former Obama advisor Jared Bernstein says this was not a tremendous recovery because politics got in the way. And Bill Press talks with independent senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. For most of its history, the Supreme Court has sided with America's aristocracy, and constitutional law expert Ian Millhiser says that's because justices have no connection with the common people. And we say hello to Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund and the editor of Think Progress Justice. Ian is also the author of a new book called Injustices, The Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Ian Millhiser, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be back. Thank you so much.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, of course. Now, your book is different from others on the Supreme Court because it tells the history of the court through the eyes of people whose lives have suffered because of anti-democratic decisions. Yet, shouldn't the highest courts ignore the individuals and instead determine general legal theory?
Well, I mean, the job of the court is to follow the law. There's no question about that. But when the court decides its cases, especially when they decide cases wrong, those cases can have a tremendous impact on millions of people. I discuss in the book the plight of child laborers for much of this nation's history. In the coal towns up in Pennsylvania, they would employ 6-year-old boys. They would sit them down above a chute of coal. And the boy's job was to reach down into it, and like they saw a piece of slate or something that wasn't coal that they need to pick out of it, they'd have to pick it out and throw it in and throw it away. The boys would have their fingers crushed. They'd sometimes lose their arms because the mechanisms that moved this coal forward, their arms could get caught in it. They would fall down the trash chutes and suffocate. And of course, many of them, they'd spend 30, 40 years in the mines after that, and they'd die young men from black lung disease. The Supreme Court, after Congress passed a law banning child labor, the Supreme Court struck that law down. They doomed those children to many more years working in those coal mines, working in cotton mills in the South, working in factories up north. There were Southern cotton mill owners who wanted to eliminate adult male laborers because it was cheaper to hire kids. Their goal was to have someone start in the cotton mill when they were 6, work in the cotton mill until they're old enough to have a kid themselves, and then they'd get laid off and replaced by their own 6-year-old son. And the Supreme Court said that was right. The Supreme Court struck down that law under a theory of the Constitution that that just made no sense. They said that a regulation of child labor wasn't a regulation of commerce.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yes, the Supreme Court needs to follow the law. That's their job. But when they get it wrong, the impact is so broad and it has such tragic consequences.
Most Americans, I think, look at the court as a bulwark against discrimination. But you say that the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case that outlawed school segregation could have gone the other way, except for a series of historical accidents. What were they? Talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Sure. I mean, there are a number of them I discussed in the book. I'll just mention a few of them. So the initial vote in Brown, after the justices first heard the case, there were 3 justices who were sure votes to uphold segregation. There were 2 who were on the fence, and then there were 4 who actually wanted to do the right thing. So it looked like there was a very good chance that the good guys were going to lose. One of the 4 justices who voted to strike down segregation was Hugo Black, who had been in the Ku Klux Klan. He was a former Alabama senator, and, He had a change of heart after he got on the court, but you never would have guessed, based on who and what he was before he got there, that he would have turned out to be a champion for civil rights. The governor of South Carolina at the time, the guy who hired one of the best lawyers in the country to defend segregation, was Jimmy Burns, who was a former justice himself. And, if he decided to stay on the court rather than go on and do other things, he would have been an almost certain vote for segregation. The Chief Justice, when the case was originally decided, wasn't Earl Warren. It was Fred Vinson. Vinson was one of the three votes who voted to keep segregation, and he died of a heart attack midway through the case while it was still being considered. President Eisenhower, who put Warren on the court, later said that putting Warren on the court, he said some other choice things that I can't repeat here, but he said that putting Warren on the court was the biggest damn fool mistake he ever made. So there were all these pieces that had to fall into place. If Black had turned out like you would have expected Hugo Black to turn out, if Burns had stuck around, if Vincent hadn't died, if Eisenhower had realized that Warren was going to be a liberal justice, if this guy named Parker had been confirmed that Herbert Hoover nominated, there were all of these pieces that had to fall into place for Brown to come down the way it did. And, the more likely course of history was that Brown would have been wrongly decided.
Mm. We're speaking with Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice, and author of the book Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Why, Ian, has the Supreme Court so frequently throughout history protected the wealthy and privileged? Is it a matter that they're all privileged people, or is it something about putting on a black robe? I mean, what gives there?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, some of it is that I think a lot of it is that the justices tend to respond to the people that they tend to interact with, and for much of American history, de Tocqueville said that that lawyers are the last vestige of aristocracy in the United States. For much of American history, the legal profession as a whole was very skeptical of democracy. Believed that the law should change slowly, if at all. And it was very, very conservative in that way, and that tended to influence the justices. Now, I think, you almost have two legal cultures in the United States, where you have a mainline legal culture, but then there's a very influential conservative legal group called the Federalist Society that has worked very hard to build an alternative legal culture, and I always cover their meetings. I want to see what they're up to. They are trying to build the bridge back to the 19th century. At the last conference, they had panels on why we should get rid of the minimum wage, and they had speakers talk about why we should get rid of anti-discrimination laws. So, I think the problems, and three justices, by the way, are very prominent members of this society. So, I think the problem is that, people tend to be influenced by the people that they interact with. And one advantage of being an elected official is that members of Congress at least have to interact with people who aren't like them because they need those folks to get elected. On the Supreme Court, that's just not the case. In the modern era, what has been the worst Supreme Court decision? Bush-Gore, Citizens United, Hobby Lobby? You should ask me that question in a few months because there's a case pending in front of the Supreme Court right now that seeks to gut the Affordable Care Act. If it prevails, it will mean that millions of people lose their health insurance, possibly overnight. It will mean that as many as 10,000 people will die every year who otherwise would have lived because they won't be able to get health care. I mean, if the Supreme Court, and the legal theory in this case is a joke. The legal theory in this case is you could take one sentence of the entire Affordable Care Act, read it completely out of context, and not even read the parts of all that define the words that are used in that sentence. That's the legal theory in this case. If they go along with this, I will rank that on a scale of evil against virtually anything that the Supreme Court has done in American history.
Mm-hmm. trumping all of just those three that I even mentioned. And I mentioned Hobby Lobby. That case, of course, it carved out a religious exemption from the ACA or Obamacare. Given the political and business uproar over the Indiana religious liberty law, do you think that official intolerance is on the rise, or are more middle-of-the-road people seeing the folly of state-sponsored discrimination?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So, I mean, Hobby Lobby said for the first time that a religious objection can be used to diminish the rights of someone else. You know, what the law had been up to that point is we all have very robust religious freedoms, which we should have to exercise our faith, but it also said that you cannot use your religion to take away the rights of someone else. And Hobby Lobby changed that. I mean, Hobby Lobby said that the owners of Hobby Lobby could wield their religion as a sword in order to cut down the access to birth control that their employees were supposed to have. The open question after Hobby Lobby is whether that's also going to extend to discrimination. You know, Hobby Lobby does say that it won't extend to race discrimination, but what about anti-gay discrimination? What about discrimination against women? You know, the lesson I think from Indiana is that, you know, I don't know what the justices are going to do when that question reaches them, but the country clearly doesn't want that to happen. I mean, if the backlash was so severe that even an extraordinarily conservative governor like Mike Pence had to back down, you know, no one wants, except for, you know, a group of extraordinary radicals, no one wants a world where businesses can discriminate against someone, where business can say, I'm not going to serve you because you're gay.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of always assumed we had gotten over that in the last century. And obviously we've got some work to do.
No doubt. I mean, I've written before about how the exact same arguments claiming that religion can justify anti-gay discrimination were used to justify other forms of discrimination in the past.
Yeah.
You know, if you read the lower court's decision in Loving v. Virginia, the decision where the Supreme Court eventually struck down the ban on racial marriage discrimination, or basically struck down racial marriage discrimination, the judge in that case, his argument, which was a really common argument at the time, was that God placed different colored people on different continents, and that showed that God wanted segregation. That was an actual argument that people used to make in order to justify Jim Crow.
Well, hopefully we're evolving upward as opposed to backwards. Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice, author of a new book called Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Ian, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
All right, thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. How do we fully recover from the Great Recession? Former Obama economic advisor Jared Bernstein says, we know more about it than we think. And we'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's well known that harsh climate conditions can mess with your mind, from cabin fever to heat delirium. But America is now experiencing an even more dangerous disease called climaticus non-vocalism extremism. CNE syndrome almost exclusively afflicts a narrow segment of our population, Republican political officials and candidates. It might stem from a genetic defect, but scientists say more study is needed on that. Symptoms include an obsessive impulse by GOP politicos to deny that human-caused climate change is happening, often accompanied by a feverish insistence that government employees be banned from discussing it. Hard to believe? For an example of climaticus non-vocalism extremism, look at Governor Scott Walker's Wisconsin administration. The Koch-funded governor and Republican presidential wannabe is an ardent climate change denier, but the state's Public Lands Board has escalated his denial to Orwellian censorship. The two GOP commissioners on the three-member board, which oversees the ecological health of thousands of acres of Wisconsin forest lands, have banned agency employees from even considering damage caused by climate change. Worse, they have such a severe case of CNE syndrome that they've imposed a gag order on freedom of speech by public lands employees, prohibiting them from talking about climate change while on the job. The heartbreak of CNE is that its victims deny that they're in denial about the disease. Thus, the Wisconsin duo say that their no-speech rule is not censorship because employees are still free to talk about climate change at home or even chit-chat about it by the water cooler, just as they might talk about sports. This is Jim Hightower saying, Governor Walker, who wants to be your president, says that he finds that censorship perfectly reasonable.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Former Obama economist Jared Bernstein says we know how to fix the economy. The Fed should show patience with interest rates, and Congress must stop doing fiscal harm. And we say hello to Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and author of the forthcoming book, The Reconnection Agenda, Reuniting Growth and Prosperity. Jared Bernstein, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's nice to have you with us. You know, you recently wrote that we know more about economic policy than we think we do. By we, do you mean economists? And what is it that we know that we didn't think we did?
Well, I certainly don't mean all economists, because there are a lot of us, and some of us are acting like they haven't learned some pretty key lessons, I'd say especially in Europe, where we see lots of this austerity going on. I'll get to that in a second. But the broad point is that if you were to read a general economic textbook and follow the kinds of, I called it technocratic kind of information, basically follow the kind of systems analysis, or I talked about hydraulics, just the mechanics of how we understand economies work, then I would say yes, there are a lot of economists who understand how economies work, how they break, how they stop working, and the kinds of measures that predictably will help them improve their performance.
You mentioned technocrats, and you know the latest economic statistics for the country as a whole show tremendous recovery from the Great Recession, and you say it's due to the work of technocrats. So who are they, and what did they do?
Well, by what I meant by that is that back in the depths of the Great Recession, there is a fairly standard playbook for economics to approach such a market failure. And it involves fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, monetary policy is the stuff of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve snapped into action and took interest rates down very low, did some other actions to lower the cost of borrowing with the hopes that investors would face cheaper borrowing costs and engage in more economic activity. At the same time, fiscal policy in the form of the Recovery Act, that's just pure Keynesian textbook stimulus, got into the mix and helped slow the growth of job losses, helped pull the recovery forward so that GDP was growing pretty soon after. In fact, I pointed out in the piece where I was writing about these technocratic fixes that the economy was really just tanking in the last quarter of 2008. In early 2009, February to be precise, the Recovery Act was legislated, and in the second half of 2009, GDP was growing again. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I don't think this is a tremendous recovery. I don't think the technocrats orchestrated a tremendous success. And I actually think politics got in the way and blocked even some of the measures that the technocrats wanted to pursue. So in the real world, things don't work like textbooks. I think my point is that much of what we did when politics didn't get in the way worked much the way we thought it would.
Well, there is evidence that the President's Recovery Act worked to stimulate the economy, of course. I mean, you pointed some of that out, but there are plenty of progressives very critical of him not doing more. You were on the administration economic team. Were mistakes made?
Well, every team ought to be able to look back and acknowledge some mistakes. And in fact, I did the very un-Washington thing maybe about a year ago. I wrote a piece for the New York Times elaborating a set of things we could have done differently and done better. But I think those of us who were critical of, quote, the president for not doing more, well, that's not really correct, because the president tried to do a lot more. The president tried to, in September of 2011, I believe it was, try to pass another very significant set of programs that would have invested in a faster recovery, and he was just thoroughly blocked by the Congress. So if there was a broad mistake made, it wasn't that the Recovery Act actually wasn't big enough, because I think it was the largest we could have gotten through Congress at the time. It was that we weren't able to go back to the well and do more when more was needed.
Well, this is what's interesting, because when you see signs of what is working, you would think you would be able to go back to Congress and say, look, this is working, but we need to do more. Were there... Well,
that's a very rational observation, and we were dealing and are dealing with a very irrational Congress. I mean, yeah. It isn't like the Congress is looking at economic tables and fact-based information and saying, what can we do to improve the economy? Many of those folks are motivated by what can we do to defeat the opposition, and that's a very different guidepost.
A lot of words to that effect too. Right after the first inauguration, we're gonna
exactly.
do whatever we can to make this a one-term president and other variations of that.
Those guys, and I think they were all guys. Those guys didn't sit down and say, what can we do to make this recession go away faster? What can we do to promote growth and opportunity and productivity? What can we do to make sure that this recession is short-lived? They said, what can we do to make this a one-term president? That's a very different calculus.
Yeah. What's amazing is how much they could have helped themselves by doing more to help the country, but they didn't think that through very far.
Well, I wish I could agree with you, but unfortunately, those folks have actually done better than you might have thought.
Well, yeah. I guess that's a very good point. We're speaking with Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and author of the forthcoming book, The Reconnection Agenda, Reuniting Growth and Prosperity. Now, we've known since the 30s that government spending can lift the economy out of depression. We saw it. Why do so many people deny that and want to keep cutting taxes?
Well, I think the key answer to your question comes in the last few words, which is keep cutting taxes. Well, who benefits from tax cuts? Those at the very top of the scale. Interestingly, there's some economics here that folks might not be fully aware of, although it's really common sense, which is that who gets hurt most by a recession, say in the job market in particular? It's people who depend on their earnings, on their paychecks. Well, for those at the very top of the wealth scale, top 1%, the top half of the top 1%, they're not making their money through paychecks. They're making their money through portfolios, through asset portfolios. Now, it's not like assets didn't take a hit too in the Great Recession. They did, but they bounced back very quickly. So the folks who want to disparage government spending in the interest of ending a recession and want to cut taxes are doing so because of their own personal pocketbook issues. That is, they don't. Unemployment doesn't hurt them very much. They want low taxes so that their assets can continue to grow and compound at rates that turn millions into billions.
Can you explain why, in the midst of recovery, huge banks and corporations that are bailed out and thriving, and the people who lost their jobs and their homes are doing worse?
Well,
is it policy, or is it more than that?
I think it's policy and more than that. I think it's both. I mean, this is a very big question. So the bailouts of the banks, for example, were necessary if you believe that, as I do, that we were in a liquidity crisis where credit was completely shut down. And you need credit in order for an economy to function. It's kind of like, you can think of it in terms of the human body. I think of the bloodstream as the credit flow, and if you have corroded arteries and your blood isn't flowing through your veins, you're going to have a heart attack. Well, an economy simply can't survive without free credit flows, and so reflating the financial markets was essential. There are good arguments to be had about how that was done and who benefited and who didn't. Certainly, I think there's a strong case to be made that little was asked of the financial institutions who were bailed out, who were rescued from illiquidity with large injections of resources from the federal government and from the Federal Reserve. Very little was asked of them, and they started doing much better very soon. And as soon as they came back to life, they were fighting against all the regulations in Dodd-Frank and taxes in ways that are kind of predictable. The analogy is that at the time when I was working for the administration, the analogy I had in my head was you're driving down the road and there's this dog that's been hit by a car on the side of the road. It's a Doberman Pinscher, but it's just bleeding, and you take it in the car and you try to make it all better, and you get it to the vet and you give it surgery and you pay for all of it, and then it gets all better and then it attacks you.
That's about as well as you could probably explain it, I think, right? I mean, that's
the analogy that I tell myself, for what it's worth.
Well, now that you're out of government, what's your magic fix for the economy? If you had free reign and you could just do whatever, and you knew what was the right thing to do, what would you do?
Well, I think one important point is that it's not magic. So that's the whole technocratic point. And just so listeners know, I wrote a piece about this called something like "How Technocrats Helped Promote the Recovery" or something like that. And the idea there is that, in fact, as I answered in response to your first question, is that it's not magic. We know the basic playbook and the menu. And right now, to get to your question, what would be the most important thing for the economy? It would be two things, fiscal and monetary. On the monetary side, the Federal Reserve should really show a great deal of patience before they raised interest rates to slow the economy down. Now, their key interest rate, which they move up and down, up to slow the economy, down to speed it up, has been around zero since 2009, so for a long time now. And they're itching at the trigger to raise that rate. But in fact, the kinds of pressures that would legitimately signal a rate hike, acceleration in wages or acceleration in prices, we certainly see nothing at all like that in the data, either in the near term or in terms of what people are expecting down the road. So the Fed has to stay put where it is, and the fiscal authorities, the Congress, has to do no harm. They can't go austere and cut spending at a time like this. They can't engage in debt ceiling and fiscal cliff games. I think do no harm from the fiscal authorities and patience at the Fed would help a great deal right now.
And we wish you the best of luck with that.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
That would be a heck of a lot to get done. Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, author of the forthcoming book, The Reconnection Agenda, Reuniting Growth and Prosperity, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Jared, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you being with us, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
My pleasure.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, independent senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders.
We will remember this day as the day that Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont announced that he is a candidate in the Democratic Party, a Democratic candidate for president in 2016. He, of course, is the senator from Vermont. My former boss spent a year as an intern for Senator Bernie Sanders, and our new candidate for president in 2016 joining us on our news line this morning. Senator Sanders, good morning and congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Great to be with you.
You went out, you told us a few months ago you were going to go out and test the waters around the country. What persuaded you to go from testing the waters to actually running?
Well, I did test the waters. I was out in Iowa. I've been in New Hampshire. I've been in South Carolina. I've been in the West Coast. I've been in Texas. I've been in many parts of the country. And, Bill, what I'm finding with very large crowds coming out is that people are extremely frustrated and, in fact, sick and tired of what's going on in this country, where for ordinary people they are working longer hours for lower wages, where people sit back and worry whether their kids are going to be able to afford to go to college, whether they're worried about their jobs going to China. And meanwhile, they're seeing 99% of all new income being created going to the top 1%, and the top 1/10% owning almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. So they're looking at an economy and they're saying, what's going on in this economy? I'm working working 2 jobs, I'm working 3 jobs. I'm not going anywhere, and yet the people on the top are doing phenomenally well. And I think people are sick and tired of that. They want an economy that works for all Americans and not just for the billionaire class.
And they want somebody who will fight for them, right? They need a voice.
I think they do. I think people look around and they say, look, the corporations who have so much power in America could care less about the average American. They stash their money in the Cayman Islands. They don't pay taxes. They'll move to China tomorrow if they can save a few bucks by hiring cheap labor abroad. They look at the political system and they see a Republican Party which has moved very, very far to the right, essentially controlled by the Koch brothers and other billionaires. And they look at the Democratic Party and not seeing people who are prepared to stand up and say, you know what, we have got to fight back. This country belongs to all of us and not just to a handful of people. So I think you're right. And people want to see fundamental changes in the way we do economics and politics in this country.
Now, you know, Senator, what the establishment, if you will, is already saying about your candidacy. You can't win because you're too far left and you won't have enough money. What's your take on that? How do you respond to that?
Well, let me just talk about the money issue. Bill, you and I have chatted about this. I worry very, very much that as a result of this disastrous Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, that we are losing every day the foundations of American democracy. And that is that you have a situation where the Koch brothers and other billionaire families, and the Kochs in particular, may be now a more powerful political force than either the Democratic or Republican Party. They have more. They're going to spend more money. Mm-hmm. They have a better organization. This is one family, the second wealthiest family in America that, by the way, wants to end Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, EPA, et cetera, et cetera. So what we are looking at in an election, and it's absolutely true, where candidates will receive unbelievable hundreds of millions of dollars from super PACs. Super PACs may, in fact, end up spending more money than their own campaigns. So this is an issue. Can I compete with that? Absolutely not. We have relied throughout my political life on small individual contributions. I've gotten a higher percentage of small contributions than any other candidate for the Senate. But we'll have to do the best that we can. And, the money will come in at $50 and $100 and $25, and I appreciate that very much. But, we're not going to have billionaires putting money into a super PAC. But having said that, I think we can raise enough money we can raise enough money to run a winning campaign. May not be as much as other people, but it can be enough money.
And the idea that you are too far left to be out of the mainstream?
Well, let me tell you something. That I'm not into this left-right stuff. If you ask people questions and you say to people, should we rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and create 13 million jobs, which is legislation that I have offered, you know what people say? Yes. Whether they are Democrats, Republicans, or moderates in the middle. If you ask people, should we raise the minimum wage to a living wage, and over a period of years, I think that wage should be $15 an hour, majority of the American people say yes. Should we ask the wealthiest people and largest corporations to start paying their fair share of taxes? American people say yes. Should we invest in education and make college affordable for all of our people? The American people say yes. So I think, and you go down the list, you know, there's some areas where that may not be true. Climate change, there is still a whole lot of Republicans who are not on board with the reality that climate change is caused by human activity. But I think that when you look at issue after issue, the American people, no matter whether they're conservatives or progressives, understand they're getting screwed, and the big money interests are making out like bandits. They want change.
Senator Bernie Sanders, our guest, the just newly announced Democratic candidate for president of 2016. Senator, one of the big issues facing the Senate you've been involved in is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Obama wants it, said it's necessary to keep America in the forefront of global trade. Your position?
No, I'm adamantly against it, Bill. Ever since I have been in Congress, in the House, and then in the Senate, I have voted against all of these trade agreements because I understood that they were pushed very hard by the multinational corporations and by Wall Street. And for the big money interests, these trade agreements are great because what they can do and what they have done is shut down manufacturing facilities here in the United States of America where working people were making a decent living. I shut them down here and moved to China and other low-wage countries. That's the fact. That's an indisputable fact that we have lost millions of decent-paying jobs because of NAFTA, because of permanent normal trade relations with China, because of the Korean trade agreement. It makes no sense to me to keep going down a path which has failed us in the past. In the past, what we need is a new set of trade policies which work for working people in our country and working people abroad, and not just the multinationals.
And one final question. If you said some of the Republican candidates for president get all tripped up on this, that if a friend of yours who happened to be gay was getting married, would you dare go to that gay wedding?
Oh, please, Bill. I mean, it's almost an absurd question. We have.
It is, isn't it? But
in my office and in my life, we have many, many friends who are gay, of course.
Yeah, I mean, this it's a Supreme Court decision. Let's just hope they come with the right decision.
And I should tell you that I'm very proud that in my small state of Vermont, we have led the way in this country.
Yeah.
First with civil unions and then with gay marriage. So I think in our state, we understand that you don't discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation.
Well, we got to tell you, Senator, you got a lot of strong, excited support from our listeners and our viewers here on the Bill Press Show. We started the show this morning with a call from George down in Otto, North Carolina, who he said he's been driving around for the last 4 months with your name painted on his truck because he couldn't get a bumper sticker. So we're going to...
All right, tell George he's going to get a bumper sticker soon. Give us a ring.
Yeah, we will indeed. It's BernieSanders.com is where you can join in this great campaign with Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator, good luck. Congratulations. We'll see you down the road.
Okay, Bill. Thanks very much. Take care. Right. Bye-bye.
There he is, Bernie Sanders, off and running.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ian Millhiser, Jared Bernstein, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.